I never intended to become a skeptic of the world's most established timelines. My initial goal was academic, almost mundane. I was attempting to compile a comprehensive map of European royal marriages for a project on political alliances. I was looking at the usual suspects: the Habsburgs with their sprawling empire, the Romanovs in the shivering east, the Tudors and their dramatic exits. I was prepared for complexity. I was prepared for incestuous tangles and political maneuvering. But I wasn't prepared for the silence. It started as a subtle itch in the back of my mind, a pattern of missing connections that, once observed, refuses to be ignored. When you look at the official family trees presented in textbooks or displayed in museum halls, they present a comforting, unbroken chain. Father to son, mother to daughter. A seamless river of bloodlines preserved through arranged marriages and forged alliances. It looks solid. It looks inevitable. But when I stopped looking at the polished summary and started digging into the raw date of the birth registries, the marriage contracts, the obscure parish recordsy, found gaps that simply shouldn't exist. These weren't the messy, jagged gaps of lost history. They were clean, surgical incisions. The transitions happened too smoothly. The genealogies appeared fully formed, as if they had been written backward from a conclusion that had already been decided in a boardroom, not lived in a palace. And that is where the anomaly becomes impossible to ignore. To see what I saw, you have to start with a simple exercise. I want you to pull up any major European royal family tree from the critical transition period of the 18th or 19th century. Don't look at the kings. Their histories are often retroactive fabrications. Follow the maternal lines. Look at the wives. Now ask yourself a question that rarely gets asked in history class. Where did these women come from before they married into these massive, world-dominating dynasties? The official explanation is always dismissive. It tells us they came from minor nobility, or were distant cousins, or princesses from German principalities so microscopic they barely warranted a dot on contemporary maps. We accept this. We assume a king marries a minor princess for strategy. But here is the strangest part. When you try to trace these women's own ancestry back just 2 or 3 generations, the documentation hits a wall. It becomes remarkably sparse. Not just incomplete, which is natural for the era, but sparse in a specific, curated way. It is as if their histories began the exact moment they became useful to the narrative of the husband's dynasty. Before that moment, a void. Consider the sheer, illogical nature of this. We are talking about the most record-obsessed families in human history, people who believe their blood rights came from God himself. Would they truly pollute that divine bloodline with women whose backgrounds were essentially unverified? Or were those backgrounds widely known at the time, but deliberately obscured by later historians to hide a connection to a world that was being erased? The more I pulled at this thread, the more the tapestry of European royalty began to unravel. Consider the marriages that consolidated power across Europe in the 1700s. We are told by every historian worth their tenure that these unions were strategic, political, and calculated to the finest degree. They were chess moves on a continental board. Yet, if you look closely at the pieces being moved, the logic dissolves. The brides often appeared with minimal lineage documentation, yet they married into the most rigorously documented families in human history. Once the ring was on the finger, their origins became unquestioned fact. No one asked. No one verified. The silence was deafening. This raises a simple but critical question that I can't shake. If these royal houses were so obsessed with bloodline purity, their entire claim to rule was based on the specific divine composition of their blood, why would they accept brides whose ancestry couldn't be traced with certainty? They wouldn't. Not unless that ancestry was known perfectly well to the inner circle, but was being deliberately obscured from the public record. Look at the Romanovs. The official history tells us they descended from the Rurik dynasty, a clean, noble line of succession stretching back centuries into the mists of early Rus. But the deeper I went into the genealogical records, the more I found transitions that seemed managed, constructed. The documentation exists. Certainly you have the marriage certificates, the birth records, the grand court announcements. But what about the bloodline itself? There are whispers in the archives. Academic whispers, the kind mentioned in obscure footnotes and then never expanded upon, terrified of ruining a career. These notes speak of Tatar ancestry in several major Russian noble families. And let's be clear, not Mongolian. Tatar. The word itself is a derivative, a linguistic cousin to a name we are not supposed to say out loud in respectable historical circles. Tartary. Now look westward. The pattern repeats with unsettling precision. The British royal family underwent a similar radical transformation. In 1714, the House of Hanover was imported from German territories to take the British throne. We are given the official explanation, the necessity of Protestant succession, parliamentary approval, a legitimate claim through distant Stuart ancestry. All documented, all proper, all very convenient. But when you examine the German principalities these royals came from, you find something peculiar. Many of these small territories had themselves undergone recent, violent dynastic changes. New families, new names, new crests all appearing within a generation or two of being called upon to provide British monarchs. It's as if these minor German states were acting as holding pens, or perhaps incubators, for a bloodline that was being laundered before it could be seated on the throne of England. The evidence suggests something much larger than isolated dynastic accidents. But perhaps I'm seeing patterns in randomness. Perhaps these genealogical gaps are simply the normal erosion of time, the inevitable loss of parchment to rot and war. I might have believed that if I hadn't started looking at the buildings these families built. Because while paper can be forged and ancestry can be invented, stone is much harder to lie about. I realized that paper trails could be faked, but masonry is a much more stubborn witness. So I stopped reading names and started looking at the buildings these families built. I'm not talking about the ancient castles they inherited from the Middle Ages. I'm talking about the ones they constructed during their sudden consolidation of power in the 18th century. Go to St. Petersburg and look at the Winter Palace. Then cast your eyes to London and the major renovations of Buckingham Palace. Travel to Vienna and stand before the expansions of the Schönbrunn Palace. Finally, look at Madrid and the Royal Palace, constructed following the convenient 1734 fire that destroyed the previous Habsburg Residencia, fire that erased centuries of history just in time for a new architectural narrative to rise from the ashes. Official history waves a hand and attributes all of this to the Neoclassical revival or Baroque influence. They tell us it was a trend, a fashion that swept the continent. But here is what troubles me. These buildings don't just share stylistic choices like columns or pediments. They share specific, high-level technical features. They share identical construction methods, unified proportion systems, and what I call decorative mathematics. When you analyze the load-bearing structures, the vaulting techniques, and the complex geometry required to keep these massive stone piles upright, the pattern repeats with unsettling precision. We see the same mathematical ratios governing window placements across thousands of miles. We see the same acoustic engineering in the great halls. This uniformity appears across cultures that supposedly had minimal contact, and across royal houses that were allegedly bitter rivals, constantly at war. Who were the architects? The history books give us different names in different countries, certainly. Rastrelli in Russia, Nash in England, Fischer von Erlach in Austria. But when you try to trace where these men trained, where they learned to build at such a massive scale with such specific uniformity, the trail goes cold. Not everywhere, just at the critical points. We know who they were, but we don't know how they knew what they knew. The specific transmission of this advanced engineering knowledge is missing. If these were rival nations, why were they building using the exact same proprietary technology? It would be like the Soviet Union and the United States building their nuclear bunkers using identical blueprints during the height of the Cold War. It doesn't happen. Unless the rivalry is theater and the builders belong to the same guild. Many of these buildings were constructed or significantly modified during the same narrow window of time, the early to mid-1700s. This is the exact period when the name Tartary was beginning to disappear from maps and new dynasties were consolidating power. The official story asks us to believe in incredible coordination by coincidence. It requires architects from competing empires to independently discover identical mathematical systems to build at a massive scale in multiple capitals simultaneously. If you are finding value in this investigation, I encourage you to pause and explore these architectural connections yourself. The evidence is hiding in plain sight. But stone is only half the story. To understand the scale of what was hidden, we have to look at how they drew the world before they decided to change it. We have to talk about the maps. Now let's talk about maps. Because maps don't lie the way words can lie. Words can be rewritten, books can be burned, and archives can be purged. But a map is a snapshot of the world as it was understood at that specific moment. It shows what was known, what was believed, and most importantly, what existed in the minds of the men who drew them. I spent days poring over high-resolution scans of maps of Asia from the 1600s and 1700s. French maps, Dutch maps, British maps, the work of the finest cartographers of their age. If you look at the vast interior of what we now call Russia and China, you don't see a blank space. You see a massive territory labeled Tartary or Grand Tartary or Tartaria. This wasn't a small region. It wasn't a footnote. It was an enormous territory stretching from the Caspian Sea to the Pacific Ocean, from the frozen forests of Siberia down to the frontiers of China and India. The official explanation collapses here. We are told that Tartary was just a catch-all term Europeans used for the vast, unknown interior of Asia, placeholder name like the Wild West. A map label, not a real political entity. But that explanation requires us to believe that European cartographers, who were sophisticated enough to accurately map intricate coastlines, river deltas, and trade routes elsewhere, suddenly became vague and imprecise only when it came to the largest landmass on their maps. These were not speculative drawings. These were trade maps and military maps. They were drawn by men who staked their professional reputations and often their live-son accuracy, because merchants and generals depended on that accuracy to survive. And on many of these maps, you find something fascinating. You don't just see empty land. You see symbols indicating cities. You see marked trade routes. And yes, you see royal courts. Multiple royal courts scattered throughout Tartarian territory. The maps depict an organized society with governmental structures, not a collection of wandering tribes in empty tents. But then, over the course of the late 1700s and early 1800s, something strange happens. The label changes. On the maps, Tartary begins to dissolve. It becomes Russia in the west, pushing relentlessly eastward. It becomes Qing China in the south, pushing northward. The vast middle ground becomes nameless. The deeper I looked, the more I had to ask, where did the people go? We can watch the land get redistributed on the maps, colored in with new imperial dyes. But the people, the royal courts, the cities those earlier cartographers swore existed, Where did they go? Here is what bothers me most. When empires fall, we have transition periods. We have documentation of collapse. Rome didn't vanish overnight. We have centuries of its decline meticulously recorded. The Byzantines left volumes of historical testimony about their final, desperate days. Even the fragmentation of the Mongol Empire is well documented. But Tartary, if it existed as these maps suggest, we should have transition documentation. We should have treaties of dissolution. We should have records of massive refugee crises, resistance movements, succession disputes. Something. Instead, we get silence. And into that silence, we get new royal families with suspiciously recent genealogies claiming territories that maps from just a generation earlier labeled as something else entirely. Here is what bothers me most about the disappearance of Tartary, the silence of the transition. History, real history, is messy. It is loud. When empires fall, they do not vanish. They shatter. We have documentation of the collapse. Rome didn't just turn off the lights and leave. We have centuries of its decline meticulously recorded in the letters of panicked generals, in the sermons of bishops, and in the layers of ash and rubble found by archaeologists. The Byzantines left volumes of historical testimony about their final days, detailing the sieges and the desperation. Even the Mongol Empire's fragmentation is well documented through the squabbles of the various khans. If it existed as a cohesive entity, as those maps suggest, we should have transition documentation. Where are the treaties of dissolution? Where are the records of the refugees that inevitably flood neighboring borders when a state collapses? Where are the resistance movements, the succession disputes, the wars of independence? Instead, we get absolute silence. It is as if the land was rebooted. And into that silence, we get these new royal families with their suspiciously recent genealogies, claiming territories that maps from a generation earlier labeled as Tartarian. We are told that Tartary was a myth, a misunderstanding. But that requires us to believe that the entire cartographic community of Europe hallucinated a civilization for 200 years. It requires us to believe that the void left behind was filled by natural expansion from the West, without any significant conflict or displacement worth recording. Now we arrive at the most troubling aspect. The bloodline question isn't just historical anymore. It's genetic. We live in the age of the genome. We can trace ancestry through DNA with terrifying precision, confirming or refuting genealogical claims that once relied solely on dusty parchment. So, why hasn't there been a comprehensive genetic study of European royal families mapping their actual ancestry? I'm not talking about small, targeted studies to identify hemophilia markers. I mean a complete mapping of the royal bloodlines using modern genetic techniques. These families are obsessed with their heritage. They spend millions maintaining archives, commissioning biographies, and restoring castles to prove their legitimacy and their divine right to rule. Yet they have shown a remarkable, almost disciplined disinterest in the one scientific tool that could prove their lineage once and for all. Why? Unless there is something they don't want found. Consider what DNA testing has revealed about ancient populations. We now know that groups we thought were isolated and pure were actually mixed, showing genetic markers from continents away. We know that pure bloodlines are a myth, that humanity is a tapestry of mixing and migration. So, what would a comprehensive genetic study of European royalty show? What markers might appear that don't match the official family trees? What Central Asian or Siberian genetic signatures might emerge from families who claim pure Germanic, French, or British descent? The silence here is perhaps the loudest of all. It is not just a lack of data. It is a suppression of curiosity. How do you suppress curiosity about your own origins in an age of genetic discovery? You don't. Unless you already know what the results would show, and you know that those results would shatter the narrative you've spent 3 centuries building. If silence is how they handle the genetics, then fire is how they handle the paper. Count the fires. Seriously, make a list of major fires that destroyed royal residences, government archives, and genealogical records between 1650 and 1850. The Royal Palace in Madrid, 1734 gone. The Library of Congress, 1814 burned. The Hanover State archives multiple fires, most records lost. Some fires are inevitable. Buildings were made of dry timber and lit by open flame. Accidents happen. But the deeper I looked, the more I found these infernos occurring at suspiciously convenient moments. They happen right before a genealogical claim needs verification. They happen right after a territorial transition. They happen precisely when old records would contradict the new official narrative. And after each fire, the reconstruction of the records always favored the newly established order. The slate wasn't just cleaned, it was replaced. But they couldn't burn everything. Before you dismiss this as speculation, let me show you something specific that survived the purge. Go to Vienna and stand in front of the Schönbrunn Palace. Now, transport yourself to St. Petersburg and the Winter Palace. Finally, look at Beijing, specifically the outer buildings of the Forbidden City. What do you notice? It isn't just a vague similarity in style. It is the exact same proportion system. The relationship between height and width, the ratios in the window placements, the mathematical principles governing the spatial relationships, they are identical. This isn't coincidence. This is transmitted knowledge. It is specific technical knowledge about large-scale construction and load distribution that was supposedly isolated to specific cultures. Yet here it is, spanning from Austria to China, built during the exact period when Tartary was being erased from a map. And then there is the symbol, the double-headed eagle. It appears in the heraldry of the Holy Roman Empire, the Russian Empire, the Byzantine Empire, and various German principalities. We are told this symbol was adopted independently, that it means different things to different people. But symbolism this specific doesn't emerge randomly. The double-headed eagle looks east and west simultaneously. It is the perfect sigil for an empire that spanned both continents, an empire that was eventually split, its history partitioned between the West and the East, its unified origin forgotten. These families weren't copying each other's homework. They were using a common symbolic vocabulary because they came from a common source. A source that needed to be hidden to maintain the illusion of separate, distinct national identities. The deeper I went, the more I realized that what we call history might just be the story the victors agreed to tell. Somewhere in the margins, in the deleted chapters, in the ash of the convenient fires and the silence of the genetic labs, there is another story. A story about who really built the world we inherited. I'll leave you with this. The next time you walk past a government building with neoclassical columns, or see a royal crest with a 2-headed bird, ask yourself, who are they really signaling to? When you look at a modern map of Asia, ask yourself what was there before the borders were drawn in ink. Once you see the pattern, you can't unsee it. The history books are closed, but the evidence is still standing all around us, waiting for someone brave enough to read the stone.